Hey folks, Zach Osman here. I am Insider Indianapolis Star. This is a Mind Your Manners special. It is Thursday, November 14th, 2024. I'm not sure when you'll hear this, but that's when we're recording it. It is a Mind Your Manners special. We've been trying to bring extra voices onto the podcast this year, extra perspectives, particularly, and there goes my outlook. That's always fun, particularly with everything that's been going on around IU football this season. And we are thrilled to be joined today by the first guest in podcast history who knows as much about the S&S cafeteria in Macon as I do, Mr. Stephen Godfrey. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us.
That's exactly what I'm sure the Indy Star audience is excited about. Two people from Georgia.
I mean, they get one person. They get one person from Georgia no matter what. So like they're already hip deep, really.
Do you want to explain your sweater real quick?
Oh well, so people. I've actually worn this to Kurt Signetti press conferences, plural, already this fall. Okay. This was a semi-pro hockey team down in Macon. Because you're from Macon, right? Like you
I was born in Macon. Yeah, I was born in Macon. My dad's family are all from Macon, and then my mom's family are from like Roswell, Alpharetta.
Gotcha. Okay. I think we've talked about that before, and I just can't remember because once you have kids, your brain doesn't retain information.
Sure.
My grandparents lived in Macon when my grandfather worked for Georgia Power. He was the plant manager of the plant out on the Ocmulgee River that I think is no longer operational. But after he retired, they moved out to a small town called Bolingbroke. And if anyone listening knows anything about Bolingbroke, Georgia, you win a gold star. And yeah. I mean, seriously, I will come to your house and give you a gold star sticker like they give my 2-year-old at gymnastics. Please don't eat it like he does every single week. But this is we used to go to Macon Whoopee games all the time. I think it was voted, like SI voted it like the number 2 all-time sports nickname. So it's many a Macon memory being made here. And we are going to talk about, I guess today I don't have a great segue from that to talking, but first about really your podcast, Stephen, because this has been, I have really enjoyed this. I know you and Ryan Nanni have been putting it together. Since the summer? I think like what is I guess the first question is, I know you talk about it in the podcast, but like what is the origin of trying to tackle a question? The podcast is called Who Killed College Football? And that is the sort of thing that comes up at my family gatherings in various different forms all the time. Why is all of this sort of chaotic aggressive around my favorite sport all the time? And there's never any one easy answer to that. You and Ryan try to tackle that. Like, what made you want to take on basically such an enormous sort of question, I guess?
I want to acknowledge the irony of coming on an Indiana-centric podcast to talk about who killed college football in, Indiana's inarguably their best football season in history. Maybe it was the Hoosiers. The show's title was a play on two things. Shortly after his retirement from college football, Nick Saban went to a congressional, it's basically a public event. It wasn't an official hearing. There was no inquiry. There was no committee connected to the legislative branch. He went up to DC to a big public event, and he was complaining, as Nick is wont to do when he doesn't get his way about everything. And he said, the game of college football as I know it, the game I coached for years and decades and all this stuff, it no longer exists. And so when we were building this show, we were like, thank you. Perfect. So it's dead, right? And that allowed us the narrative device to borrow a very popular structure or trope, whatever you want to call it in podcasting, which is the murder mystery. So Who Killed College Football? I have done a lot of promotion on this show. And of course I get like the sort of smarmy sports talk radio thing where it's like, it looks pretty live to me. Like that's not what we're getting at. We started talking about this in like 2017. We all worked at Vox Media at SB Nation. And ideas and versions of this that look very different kicked around for years. And then Ryan and I finally came up with the concept and we said, all right, we have a format. Podcasting helps because it's a storytelling format. It's something where people, if they know who we are, we've done other shows. I'm on Split Zone Duo. Ryan's member of the Shutdown Fullcast. We had podcasting audiences who were familiar with us in college football. We said, all right, let's walk it out, because whatever one complaint you might hear or voice yourself about the state of college football, you don't like it, or you don't like the way it's, where it's headed. You feel like it's really weird that, players are getting paid, or that Cal and Stanford are in the ACC, whatever it might be. Let's walk out all of those issues sequentially and talk about every single power structure, every single evolution of the sport, and how we got to this incredibly bizarre, really, I really feel like it peaked the last 3 or 4 years. The why of why we're doing this show is that I've never encountered more people feeling bad about the thing they love more than I have in the last 3 years.
I think that's fascinating because, and I think, like, one of my favorite stories, and I forget which episode, I think it was the conferences episode, where you were talking about how USC and UCLA kind of forced the Arizona schools on the rest of the Pac-8 because of something that I think people think is a modern construct, which is basically just adding revenue.
Sure.
It feels like there is always and maybe this is just human nature, I don't know, but it certainly applies to sports, a desire to see, like, the problems of the present as the worst and perhaps only problems that have ever existed.
Right.
But it's been fascinating to me, even as someone who, went into the podcast series thinking I was probably more well informed on a lot of college sports issues and history than the average person, to just kind of trace so much of this back so many years. Obviously the Board of Regents case is mentioned prominently, different, sort of conference shuffling going back to a time when a lot of schools were independents and things like that, but also almost just tracing, whether you're talking about the conferences, the NCAA. I think the NFL episode is fascinating and thought-provoking, but kind of this idea that, that it's not all just a little bit of history repeating, but you can find similar points in college football history when certain segments of its audience or its constituency might have felt similarly to the way some fans do now. Is that fair in your mind?
Yeah, no, I think there's several key points in which people say, hey, this thing's over, or this thing's ending, or it's not going to continue if X keeps happening, or this doesn't happen. I don't want to give away the farm by any stretch, but we examine suspects. So I'm gonna look over at my board. So, suspect number 1 was television. Suspect number 2, conferences. Suspect number 3, which is the obvious one that I think everyone kind of thought based on my career that we would start with, is the NCAA. Then we have the NFL, and we just released to our subscribers, they get early access, wkcfb.com. We just released the next suspect, which is coaches and their agents. And then we all have one more suspect to go. We're going to have an epilogue. We're going to end season 1 there, mainly because each script is, by the end of it, we will have written a book of scripts. So it's a lot of work. We also were very, very, very stupid, and we did it during college football season because we're idiots. And not the easiest time of year, as you know, to do something like that. So we it's a lot. And in the process of answering these questions, because I'm sure anyone listening probably has a slightly different vantage point. Hey, I don't like the fact that, if you're an Indiana fan in the Big Ten, you probably don't you probably believe ESPN has an SEC bias, right? That is it.
Trust me.
That is,
yes.
Yeah. Powerful, legitimate concern. Yeah.
This fall has certainly revealed the answer to that question to be yes.
Yes. And so we wanted to create a single story that addresses every concern, takes the historical context, applies it to the modern reporting, and then tries to give you a conclusion as to why it happened, why we think it'll keep happening, and then what happens next. Because, the weird, it really depends on your fan base, depends on who you are in this machine. If you're media, things haven't been great. But if you're in the business of college sports and you're on the top end, things are pretty good, right? The next 5 years are going to look very, very different than the previous 5 and maybe the 5 after that. The rate of change in the sport, I think, really has disoriented people. And that's kind of where we wanted to kind of maybe put an arm around the listener and say, hey, if you feel weird, it's okay.
Ryan said something, I think this was in the NCAA episode, and I'm not trying to just sort of forgive me, I'm not trying to turn this into like Chris Farley being like, do you remember when you were with the Beatles? Like, that was awesome. But he said something that really sort of stuck with me. I think it was in the NCAA episode, and I'm curious for your thoughts on like why this seems to really grab people from the college football perspective. I understand it's the most popular college sport. I understand it's the biggest moneymaker.
Sure.
But he also said something that football is the only sport that requires such a direct and lasting, and he was talking about athletes, but I think in some ways this can extend out to coaches, even administrators, that requires like a lasting relationship with the NCAA in the sense that you can be a professional in basically any sport,
right?
And there's a reasonable path to skipping college altogether, or even something like basketball. You have to be there for, let's be honest, if you're that level of prospect, 9 months. Like, why do you think it is, whether it is the NCAA's relationship, whether it is like the way the NFL interacts with it, and the purpose that sort of college football serves the NFL, that basically it seems like with all of this, and maybe it is just the money. I mean, maybe it's just the money, stupid, and that's the answer to my question. But like, why is it that it seems like when we talk about all of these changes affecting college athletics, it seems like with football, everything is so much more magnified than even $1 billion sport like basketball?
I think a lot of that has to do with the NFL, the popularity and the power of the NFL. This is the supply chain for professional football. Professional football is the most dominant entertainment property in the United States, short of maybe a few film franchises in terms of revenue or power. I believe the stat was last year, the top 50 rated television programs on American television, 47 were live football, 45 of those were the NFL. That's a tone setter. I think that's where you start. The revenue opportunities right now in football are a little bit stronger on the collegiate level, a lot bit stronger depending on how you do it, than basketball. The NCAA also owns the postseason tournament. That has kind of been a positive and a negative depending on what point of history we're looking at. I think that there's probably a larger conversation to be had. And I'll be honest, my entire career has covered football, so I don't want to stray into something I don't really know about. I spent about 2 years as a preps reporter covering basketball a long time ago. And so I'll be careful with this audience, but college basketball has suffered and maybe made some unwise decisions. And I think structurally they still have a kind of a regular season identity crisis. It's funny though, because that comes up in a lot of pearl clutching and doomsdaying about the postseason structure in football, not just now in the 12-team expansion, but throughout history. A lot of really, really rich people who were vested in the bowls would use March Madness against college football and say, look at what basketball's become. Who cares about a November basketball game? And that's certainly reductive. And I think it just depends on what part of the country you're in and, what fan base you're talking about. Just like you, I have to cover and pay attention to the selection show every Tuesday night. And I was watching the end of Kansas, Michigan State in Atlanta, and like people cared about that basketball game. That's an impactful event. So I think some of it is overblown. But football is always going to drive the conversation just because of the sport's pure relevance in American culture right now. So it's multiple conversations at once. I don't necessarily want to be one of these people that says like college basketball is dying. I definitely don't think that's the case. It is a sport that commands a whole month. That's still something in America.
I don't want to ask you to give away the farm, but you called this, first of all, you called this season 1. So I guess the natural follow-up to that is like, do you see this evolving? Do you think there's a firm end to sort of you and Ryan telling this story, or do you think it's something you would like to keep open-ended to it evolving as you talk about, like, we are about to enter like simultaneously 4 brave new worlds in college athletics? Do you think
Right.
This show can keep evolving with those, I guess?
So the beauty of podcasting is that it's a low lift in terms of a business. So we don't have to. There's no camera crews or actors or anything like that. We set out to do this. We knew the story we wanted to tell, and I've referred to it as season 1 a couple times because I believe that you can listen to season 1, and it's only, I always forget these things, six episodes. So it's anthology episodes, and that what that means is there's 6 suspects. You can listen to those episodes in any order if you want to. There's a prologue and an epilogue. So that's 8 episodes. That's 8 podcasts. That's it. And the suspect episodes are like 70 minutes a piece. So it's a bit of a lift. It's kind of like listening to an audiobook. And we could, we can walk away from season 1 and say, hey, we really told the story of how college football got to this point. But based on the way things are going and how, you and I understand this business, I do want to leave the door open for the potential to tell another story if that presents itself, because I'm working on the end of the series right now, and everything will be out and done basically by like Thanksgiving. So the entire series, season 1 will be done by Thanksgiving. You can just, if you're driving somewhere for the holidays, you can put it on, kind of marathon it, listen to it. And that's a complete story. But we also know this, what happened on Tuesday night was, I think, really impactful for some very powerful entities in the sport, meaning that all of a sudden there's a lot of people angry. There's so many Big Ten teams ranked ahead of SEC teams. Maybe the bracket expands. I think conferences are going to have a major problem over the next couple of years. As we record this, the Big Ten is somewhat clean in its championship picture because Indiana and Ohio State are going to play football against each other, right? So if I'm a betting man, I'm going to say, all right, well, it's probably going to be Oregon and the winner of the Indiana-Ohio State game in Indianapolis, the Big Ten championship. You can't say the same thing right now about the ACC, and you can't. Things are. I wouldn't say equally messy. The ACC provides a situation where you might have a team that's playoff caliber, doesn't go to the championship game, doesn't get in. And then the Big 12 equally is messy. We eliminated divisions. I think school presidents are very worried about the future in these mid-level conferences. And by the way, the Big 10 and SEC showed no signs of stopping the grab. I don't really know what there's left to grab, but they're trying. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that if the playoff does not hand 8 automatic bids to these 2 leagues, the SEC and the Big 10, that we will change the entire postseason format of the sport again to make those two entities happy. So there's a lot. And then we haven't even touched on House. It's just sort of colloquially referred to as the House settlement, which, if you don't know, is basically that players are going to be paid a stipend by universities in the very near future. A lot of people ask me because I, year in and year out, kind of made my living on the coaching carousel. And this year's really slow. And when you get outside of the Power 2, it's because athletic directors and boosters and presidents are saying, dude, I don't know if we could eat a $7 million buyout right now and spend commit to another $12 million in 2 years and a new assistant salary pool and everything else. Like, guys, we're going to be paying players. We have to figure out the budget for that. And so there's so much change happening. Long-winded way to answer your question. I feel like, we'll come back and revisit it, and maybe there is a season 2. Maybe there is another story to tell.
My last question, I started it and then sidetracked myself, my ADHD taking over. But like, without asking you to give away the farm, like, you have wrapped your arms around this enormous question. Like, how do you, I guess maybe the best way to ask it without is just asking straight up for the answer is, how do you go about trying to answer that question once you present, as you call them, all the suspects? You kind of go through a lot of the history, you analyze, the what and why and how and who of what got us here. Like, how do you go about, do you even try to answer the question? Do you leave it something that's more kind of open to the listener to kind of decide for themselves? Like, how do you sort of approach, like, almost answering your own question with this series?
So we'll get to that in the epilogue, which will be out Thanksgiving week. And what I'm hoping is that people who are listening to this, they probably came in saying it's the SEC's fault, it's ESPN's fault, it's the NCAA's fault, whatever. Or why didn't Congress get involved and fix this? We have all these different suspects involved. What I would like you to do is enter the series with a preconceived notion, because you probably have to care about college sports enough to listen to the show in the first place, right? And then hopefully you either maybe don't doubt yourself, but you take some new information from the show and you think like, I didn't consider what they did or didn't do, or these guys. And as we get to the ending, you don't really know if it's going to be, hey, it was Colonel Mustard in the ballroom, with the candlestick, so much as, hopefully you go into the end of the series and you don't really know what we're going to do with it.
Really quickly before I let you go, I know you have, kind of at least evaluated Indiana. What I've seen you in a couple games in the last 5 or 6 years. Obviously, we have some good mutual friends who tend not to let anyone in their orbit forget about Indiana football, no matter how good or bad things are going. I just wanted your thoughts on the season that Indiana has kind of basically had thus far in terms of, I mean, obviously, to one extent, I think everybody sort of arrives at the same answer, which is how could we see this coming? But, you talk about being someone who lives in kind of the coaching change world more in depth than even the average reporter. Like, is it surprising to you that Curt Cignetti's able to do this as quickly as he's been able to? Like, do you think that maybe this is a little bit of a function of a more modern era in college athletics, that roster turnover is not just easier, but kind of more normalized? Like, just how do you think a program like Indiana gets to a place like this so quickly?
Well, I'll start by saying hello to our friends at Home Field. And I made a tactical error the last time I was in Bloomington because, I have a lot of Home Field shirts. They've sponsored Splits and a Duo for a long time, the other podcast that I'm on. And I wore a Cincinnati shirt to an Indiana home game. And this is a Southerner's mistake, right? I'm from Georgia. I live in Nashville. I just grabbed a Cincinnati Bearcats home field shirt to wear to a home field. I didn't realize that, that's not completely kosher in Bloomington. I caught some colorful language from random IU fans. No, I love Bloomington. I really do like visiting. Anyone who tells you they saw this coming is full of it. Period. Anyone who said that you should have known this would happen, no, that's not true. Not to the scope and the magnitude and the duration of which this win streak has carried through into the home stretch. We used to kick around this concept called year zero. Myself and Bill Connolly at ESPN, we sort of coined the term, I don't know, like 10 years ago. Basically meant that when you would come into a terrible, terrible coaching situation with a roster, that you didn't have a year one, that things were so bad and you had to do so much recruiting for the future and there was no transferring back then, that you had a year zero. In other words, like, don't even start the clock on evaluating this coach until then. NIL and really the transfer portal specifically kind of killed that concept, and it sped up expectations and it sped up the pace at which coaches were evaluated, because it started to get easier to flip a bad roster into a good one. Florida State's a great example coming from 2022 into 2023. I know it's crazy to say that now because they cratered, but they added a couple key portal pieces and showed the world, like, hey, you can diligently recruit high schools. You can add skill position talent. You can become a national title contender. And Florida State went undefeated last year. None of what I'm talking about can accurately predict Indiana. There are 5 or 6 rosters that have done something like Indiana, whereas you have a successful coach at one level, he gets a job at the next level, and he brings players with him. That's not unheard of. That's happened 5 or 6 times. To have it work this effectively at a place that is so historically bad, the losingest program in college football, essentially. I think technically.
I think it is, yeah. Yes. Indiana still has the most losses unless somebody's caught them in the last,
Which, and if you're listening, or if you're watching or listening, and you don't understand it, like the NCAA, that's teams that have played X amount of games. That doesn't include like Kennesaw State or something,
Right.
So for anyone to say they saw, I knew this guy would come in and win this much this quickly with what is still technically a patchwork roster, with a quarterback from the MAC, and let's say a spine of locker room culture that he pulls the spine of his culture at JMU with a handful of players and puts them in. I will say I don't think the Hoosiers were horrible before. They weren't horrible. They just weren't winning games. There's a big difference. I think Allen was an effective evaluator of talent. I think he was a dogged recruiter, and I think he ran up against some inescapable realities. I also say this, and it's not to take anything away from what Cignetti's done. Cignetti was never going to take Indiana. He was going to take Indiana after the advent of NIL. When those conversations with Cignetti were ongoing with the university, and he was evaluating, like he set JMU up in such a great way. You knew he was going to pivot off of it. You knew he was going to go somewhere. He made sure there were assurances in place that Indiana was legitimately committed to NIL in football. That should be a credit to him. I'm not using this to excuse away what he's done successfully. He's a great coach. But so the idea that this could happen in 2016 or 2008, it's just impossible. And then when you scope out nationally, the magnitude is so weird because those of us who are not from Indiana, who have no connection to IU, associate Indiana in football as being horrible. And so for all these things to happen in year one, and you know this better than I do, you have multiple stories going on from Rourke to Cignetti to the there's some knock on the scheduling, but the individual players, the fact that like transfers are playing better than they played at their previous stops. Everybody's a genius all the time right now. Okay. By the way, that's not going to last forever, but if anyone says they saw this coming, they're lying to you. I think that there's a huge problem in sports media, but especially in college football, where everyone wants to rush around and tell you their crystal ball prediction and their analysis, and it's because of gambling and it's because of the recruiting culture. Nobody saw this coming. I thought they'd be good. If you go back, I think maybe I've done season previews for 2024, and I bet if I go back, I would say, hey, I would watch out for Indiana because I think they're going to be significant in a bowl eligibility sense. I definitely thought that. I did not think they would be in the national title picture.
Yeah, no, I mean, I picked them to win 8 games and got smacked around on social media, and then tried to go back and claim that. And people said, "Yeah, but you only picked them to win 8 games." So
yeah, isn't it crazy how fast that goes?
You're sitting here bragging about this now. I've kept you longer than I said I would, so I just have one quick question before the end, but just to build on that, if you don't mind. It's like you talk about how it won't always be this way, and I think even Indiana fans understand they're not going to be 10-0, every single year. That's not the starting point. But where do you think, especially in an NIL era, in a portal era, in an era when maybe it's traditionally not a great program, but it is first of all, obviously in the Big Ten. Second of all, it's going to have a large alumni base that it can energize and it can animate if it gets good at a sport. Like, how do you think Indiana carries this forward and maybe sets this up to be something that is a little bit more sustainable than ultimately what it's ever really obviously had before?
I think the news came out, and again, you would know better than me. It's been about 30 days since they announced they sold out the rest of their games for the season.
Yeah.
The idea that why not Indiana has to be backed up immediately, because there will be a market for Cignetti, obviously, aggressively. I'm not saying there's a particular traditional power that's looming. I'll get, let's use basketball for the audience here. You always have a coach who makes a run to the 16 out of nowhere. It's like one of those schools where, at least in the South, at least I didn't go to a basketball school, but you're like, where the hell's Iona? Like one of the, like that situation, or like what's a Bucknell? In basketball, that, like Bruce Pearl's an example. Like, I think he goes to the 16 with like Wisconsin, Milwaukee or something, and then he gets a Tennessee job. That's what happens in basketball. We are not seeing that. That used to be the case in football. You had the American Athletic Conference, the old Conference USA, that would sort of push coaches into major jobs. It's not necessarily the same anymore. What you said at the outset is the most important thing, which is there are haves and have-nots in college football right now. And Indiana is a have because they're in the Big Ten. So you need the Big Ten television revenue, check. You need a committed NIL, check. And then I think the next thing that Cignetti is looking for is that groundswell of support. He was trained by Nick Saban. He's going to start asking for things. He's going to start asking for things. And I've been to Bloomington 4 times. I know what you can build for the other sport. Okay. I've seen it. Not to be too country. I've seen it. Hey, it's possible. It is glaring. I'm just going to be totally honest. I like the football stadium because it's kind of gothic and weird and angled and old in places, but that's because I'm a college football hipster. Kurt Signetti, like, y'all better get ready. You better get bulldozers ready. You better start find funding, find funding for these projects, because you can have this season once. You might even have this season 2 out of 3 years. You will not have this season for 10 years or something like it if you don't commit to advancing underneath the wins and losses, the more wins and losses. So that's my answer.
He's Stephen Godfrey, Split Zone Duo, Who Killed College Football, WKCFB.com. Subscribe, listen. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us on Mind Your Banners. We are going to find a way to change the title and incorporate football. That's part of it. Is Mind Your Banners, and you remember the old bowl game posters that everybody would put up in their stadium? Mind your banners and your posters. That's what we need.
Well, why don't you just get some banners for football?
That's true. We can do banners for really whatever we want. I mean, I don't see why we can't do that. Thank you so much for joining us, Stephen. Thank you all for listening. This has been a Mind Your Banner special. We will be back next week with another special guest, as well as our weekly show, looking back at the South Carolina game, and obviously getting all of you ready for what I don't think, unironically, a lot of folks are calling the biggest game in IU football history.
Yeah, it is.
It's going to be interesting. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon.